The low, persistent hum of the portable money counter was a dull throb against the quiet of the desert safehouse. It wasn't mine, nor its purpose, but its presence was a constant reminder of the unseen currents that flowed beneath the surface of even the most mundane lives. I ran a gloved finger over the gritty, sun-baked surface of the counter, the fine dust clinging to the latex. My real work lay spread across the scarred wooden table. An array of weathered photographs, brittle, yellowed reports from a cold case I couldn't shake, and a few meticulously labeled bone fragments from an unrelated ancient dig site I'd been re-examining. I preferred bones. They told a clearer story, unmarred by the transient greed that machines like this suggested. The shrill ring of my satellite phone shattered the fragile piece. My hand, still dusted from the counter, snatched it from the table. Chen. Dr. Chen, we have a situation, a gruff voice crackled. It was the lead detective, his tone tight, strained. Abandoned industrial site, old foundry. Construction crew hit something. They think it's a lot of somethings. My gaze drifted to the bone fragments on my table, then to the vast, empty expanse of desert visible through the single reinforced window. Be specific, detective. Human remains. Multiple sets. And they're old. Very old by the look of them. Buried deep. We need you out here now. I sighed, a puff of dry air in the enclosed space. The cold case would have to wait. Send me the coordinates. I'm on my way. 20 minutes later, the safe house was locked, the money counter still humming its silent song to the empty room, and I was navigating my beat-up SUV across a landscape that seemed to actively resist human presence. The drive was long, the paved roads giving way to crumbling asphalt, then finally to a pockmarked dirt track that snaked through a landscape of skeletal mesquite trees and sun-bleached rock formations. The air was thick with the scent of dust and distant industry, a metallic tang that spoke of decay. The industrial site emerged from the shimmering heat haze like a ghost. Rusting corrugated iron structures, gaunt and skeletal, clawed at the pale sky. Collapsed brick walls lay scattered like ancient ruins, and the ground was a patchwork of cracked concrete and stubborn weeds. Heavy machinery bulldozers, excavators sat idle, their massive blades caked with red earth, like dormant prehistoric beasts. A cluster of emergency vehicles, their lights flashing silently in the harsh afternoon sun, marked the epicenter of the discovery. A uniformed officer waved me through a makeshift perimeter. The lead detective, a man whose face was etched with years of grim observations, met me near a gaping trench. His usual stoicism was replaced by a visible unease. "Dean, glad you're here. This is unsettling." He gestured towards the excavation. I pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, the familiar scent of latex a grounding element. The trench was a jagged wound in the earth, perhaps 15 feet deep. At its base, amidst the churned soil and exposed concrete foundations, something glinted, not metal, but bone. I descended carefully, my boots crunching on loose gravel. The air grew cooler, heavier, tainted with the damp, earthy smell of disturbed soil and something else. A faint, almost imperceptible sweetness, like old decay. My eyes, trained to find patterns in chaos, immediately locked onto the exposed remains. The first set was partial, a pelvis and a few lumbar vertebrae, half buried in a layer of dense, compacted clay. The bone was a deep, earthy brown, stained by minerals, but its structure was unmistakably human. I knelt, pulling a small brush from my kit, and began to gently clear away the clinging soil. "We found this one first," the detective said from above, his voice echoing slightly. Then the crew leader swore he saw another spot just a few yards over. My brush moved with practiced precision. As more soil gave way, a femur emerged, then a tibia. The bone surfaces were smooth, consistent with decomposition in soil, but there was an unusual compactness to the burial. It wasn't haphazard. Then I saw it. A fragment of cloth preserved by the clay clinging to the femur, and beneath it, a faint, almost invisible striation on the bone itself. Not a break, but a deliberate mark. This is... and this. I pointed to the striation. This isn't natural erosion or accidental damage. This is deliberate. And I suspect it's not just 2 or 3 individuals we're looking for. This is too precise, too methodical. My internal clock, usually so precise, seemed to falter. The meticulousness of the burial, the sheer effort involved in concealing these remains, spoke volumes. It wasn't a desperate act of concealment. It was an art perfected over time. The thought, unbidden, formed in my mind. Generations. I moved to the next exposed area, just as the detective had mentioned. Another set of remains, this one even more deeply interred, was beginning to reveal itself. A skull, mostly intact, stared blankly from its earthen tomb. But it wasn't the age or the number that sent a tremor through me. This wasn't a random discovery. This was a pattern. And the pattern was one I had studied, one that had haunted me for years. A killer, long believed inactive or dead, had left a legacy, patiently waiting to be unearthed. And I was standing right in the heart of it. The word generations hung in the cold, dry air, a silent accusation. My breath plumed before me, a ghost of a thought given physical form. I knelt beside the shallow excavation, the scent of disturbed earth and something else. Something ancient and ferrous filling my nostrils. The first set of remains, partially exposed by the construction crew's hasty dig, lay before me. A femur, bleached and brittle, protruded from the packed soil, its position too deliberate for a simple, forgotten burial. I pulled on my examination gloves, the latex snapping taut against my skin, a familiar ritual that usually brought a sense of focused calm. Not today. Today, a tremor ran through my hands, an unwelcome guest. I meticulously brushed away the loose soil, revealing more of the skeleton. It was nearly complete, articulated in a supine position, arms crossed over the pelvis. No obvious signs of violence on the visible bones, no traumatic fractures. But the burial itself was the anomaly. There was no coffin, no shroud, just the body, placed directly into the earth, then carefully covered. The soil compression around the remains was uniform, almost too perfect, as if someone had spent considerable time tamping it down, erasing any trace of disturbance. "Dean, you see this?" The lead detective's voice, usually gruff, held a note of strained disbelief. He pointed to a spot roughly 10 feet away, where another faint outline of disturbed earth was visible, barely discernible to the untrained eye. Another one. My gaze snapped to where he indicated. My stomach tightened. One was a curiosity, a tragic discovery. Two, in such proximity, spoke of something else entirely. I moved carefully, my boots crunching on the loose gravel that littered the site. As I approached the second disturbance, the subtle variations in soil color became starker. This wasn't just a haphazard dumping ground. This was a pattern. I directed a junior assistant to begin a careful, wider perimeter scan, marking every subtle change in topography, every hint of a previous excavation. With my hand trowel, I began to probe the soil at the second site. The earth here felt different, denser, a heavier clay content than the sandy loam of the first burial. This implied a disparate burial depth, or perhaps a different time of year for the interment, when the ground was wetter. Within minutes, the curve of a cranium emerged, smaller than the first, indicating a younger individual. "Different burial depth," I murmured, more to myself than to the detective watching over my shoulder. "And the soil composition. It's not uniform across the site. Either they were buried at different times, or the perpetrator sourced soil from different locations." The implications were chilling. Sourcing soil suggested premeditation, planning, a meticulous approach to concealment. It wasn't about convenience. It was about control. The afternoon wore on, marked by the methodical scrape of trowels and the hushed tones of the crew. By the time the sun dipped below the distant industrial structures, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, we had identified 5 distinct burial sites within a 100-foot radius. Each exhibited a similar, unsettling meticulousness, yet each possessed subtle differences. One individual was buried deeper, wrapped in a coarse, decayed canvas. Another, even shallower than the first, had small, flat stones arranged over the skull, a crude form of protection. The first individual appeared to be a male in his late 20s, the second a female in her early 20s. The others were harder to estimate without further examination, but their skeletal structures suggested varying ages, from young adult to middle-aged. The scene had irrevocably shifted. What began as a potential archaeological find, a forgotten, informal cemetery, had twisted into something far more sinister. The disparate burial depths, the varied soil compositions, the non-standard practices, they screamed of a single calculating hand at work, perfecting a gruesome craft over an extended period. The word generations echoed again, resonating with a terrifying clarity. This wasn't a sudden spree. This was a legacy. Later that night, far from the floodlit industrial site, I found myself in a desert safehouse with portable money counter humming. The hum was a constant low thrum, a mechanical heartbeat in the otherwise desolate quiet. It was an odd choice for a debriefing, miles from any urban center, the air thin and dry, carrying the scent of creosote bush. Dust motes danced in the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, illuminating a battered metal table covered with my field notes, preliminary sketches, and a dozen high-resolution photographs of the unearthed remains. The detective sat opposite me, his face etched with fatigue, the lines around his eyes deeper than I'd ever seen them. The money counter, placed conspicuously on a side table, continued its monotonous whir, an incongruous soundtrack to the grim reality laid out before us. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the skeletal fragments, but its presence was a constant, irritating reminder of the world outside. A world of illicit dealings that somehow, inexplicably, intersected with the silent witnesses on my table. I tapped a finger on a photo of the canvas-wrapped individual. The degradation of the fabric, the minerals staining on the bones. It suggests a significant time difference between this burial and, say, the one with the stones over the cranium. My voice was a low drone, my mind racing, making connections. We're not talking years. Detective, we're talking decades. The soil stratification, the different levels of decomposition, even the subtle changes in the type of plant root intrusion. They all point to a span of time that is extraordinary. He nodded slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw. You're saying one person. Over decades. The meticulousness, I clarified, pushing a photo of the first burial closer to him, highlighting the even soil compression. The signature. It's present in every single one, despite the variations. The careful placement, the effort to conceal, not just discard. This isn't random. This is an evolving methodology, a killer who learned, adapted, and refined their technique over time. Someone who believed they had perfected the art of disappearing. The portable money counter hummed louder for a moment, then settled back into its steady rhythm. We were not hunting a ghost from the past, and he was still out there, his legacy buried deep, waiting for us to unearth it. The portable money counter hummed, a persistent mechanical drone that resonated through the insulated walls of the desert safehouse. Its rhythm was a stark, almost perverse counterpoint to the silence of the bones spread before me. We weren't hunting a ghost from the past. The chill that had settled deep in my bones told me we were tracking a living predator, one who had perfected the art of disappearance over decades. The hum was a constant reminder of the urgent, illicit nature of our current operation, far from any official laboratory. I leaned closer to the oldest set of remains, designated Victim 1A, the brittle fragments laid out meticulously on a sterile sheet of butcher paper across my makeshift examination table. The air in the safehouse was dry, the ever-present dust motes dancing in the beam of my task lamp, illuminating the subtle discoloration of the bone, a testament to its long burial. I worked with a dental pick and a camel hair brush, carefully clearing away microscopic traces of desiccated soil from the small crevices. These bones, fragmented and weathered, represented the earliest chapter in what I now suspected was a horrifying anthology. My gaze fixed on the distal ends of the radius and ulna, just above where the carpals would have articulated. Faint, parallel grooves etched the cortical surface, almost imperceptible without magnification. They weren't the broad, irregular marks of a simple rope or cable. These were narrow, almost razor-thin indentations, yet surprisingly deep, suggesting immense, sustained pressure. I picked up a small, high-magnification loupe. Through the lens, the grooves resolved into a distinct pattern. 2 deep parallel lines, then a wider, shallower depression, repeated across both bones. It spoke of a specific type of binding, something flat and rigid, yet with edges sharp enough to score bone under duress. My mind immediately went to industrial strapping, the kind used for bundling heavy materials, but a particular gauge, a specific material. I moved to the cranium, carefully piecing together the fractured fragments. Here, the perimortem trauma was equally telling. Not the radial and concentric fractures of a typical blunt force impact, but a distinct, elongated depression on the parietal bone, about 2 inches in length and half an inch wide. The edges of the fracture were clean, almost surgical in their precision, as if a specialized tool had been used. It wasn't a hammer, nor a pipe. It was a singular, deliberate impression, a signature left in bone. The weapon, or rather the instrument, was as distinctive as the binding. Then, under the focused beam of my UV lamp, I noticed it. A faint, almost iridescent sheen on several bone fragments, particularly concentrated around the areas where the ligatures would have pressed. It wasn't a natural phosphorescence. It glowed with a pale, ethereal blue. I carefully collected a minute sample, scraping it into a sterile vial. It was a trace contaminant, something embedded in the bone matrix, protected by the years of burial. Its presence here, in a desert burial site, was anomalous. It suggested a specific industrial compound, perhaps a sealant or a heavy-duty lubricant, not something you'd find naturally in the local soil. The pieces clicked into place, not with a sudden bang, but with the quiet, terrifying precision of a well-oiled machine. The unique ligature marks, the precise, almost deliberate cranial trauma, and the unusual industrial contaminant. They weren't random. They were too specific, too consistent across the fragmented remains. This wasn't just a victim. It was a carefully packaged, meticulously disposed of piece of evidence, carrying a hidden signature. My stomach tightened. The implications were stark. This perpetrator wasn't improvising. They had a process, a chosen set of tools, and a preferred method. I turned from the bones to my laptop, my fingers already moving across the keyboard. If this pattern was consistent, then it might have been consistent across time as well. I began sifting through digitized archives, focusing on missing persons reports from the estimated period of victim 1A's death, roughly 4 decades prior. I filtered by geographical proximity to the abandoned industrial site, then by occupation, searching for any connection to specific manufacturing sectors that might employ such specialized strapping or lubricants. Hours blurred into a single, intense focus. The hum of the money counter was a constant companion, a low thrum against the frantic tapping of keys. Then a name surfaced. Not a body, but a disappearance. A factory worker, vanished without a trace from a defunct textile mill about 50 miles from the industrial site, nearly 42 years ago. But a footnote in the archived file caught my eye. A brief mention of peculiar industrial strapping found near the worker's locker, dismissed as unrelated refuse. A retired detective had been the lead on that case. His name, a faded stamp in the bureaucratic memory, was now a beacon. The department's internal directory, thankfully still accessible through my secure channels, provided a last known address, a phone number. But I had to try. This wasn't just about identifying a victim. It was about unmasking a monster. The weight of the decades-old missing persons report pressed down on me. The killer hadn't stopped. They had simply refined their art, perfected their disappearance. I picked up my satellite phone, the screen glowing with the retired detective's number. We weren't hunting a ghost from the past. The chill that had settled deep into my marrow wasn't from ancient dread, but from a very current, very active malevolence. A living killer. The light from my task lamp gleamed off a small, calcified fragment of what I suspected was a fibula, one of the more recent discoveries. My gloved fingers traced the faint, almost invisible striations on its surface. Marks that were too regular, too intentional to be natural. It was the same pattern I'd seen on the older remains, a signature etched not just in bone, but across generations. This wasn't a forgotten cemetery. This was a private collection, curated by a ghost who walked among us. My current findings, still raw and incomplete, demanded a deeper dive into the past. The distinct burial patterns, the consistent, almost ritualistic positioning of the victims, the particular type of soil matrix adhering to the older bones. They screamed for comparison. The desert safehouse, for all its isolation and security, couldn't provide that. I needed the archives. Leaving the sterile, controlled environment of the safehouse, I drove back towards the city. The landscape shifting from stark, sun-baked earth to the grimy, sprawling concrete of the urban fringe. The city's central records office was a mausoleum of paper, a place where cases went to die a slow, administrative death. It was a vast, windowless building, smelling faintly of ozone, stale coffee, and the unique, acrid scent of decaying paper. She squinted at my badge, then at me. Dr. Chen, we don't get many anthropologists down here, especially not for that era. Most of those files are boxed, some microfished. You'll need a specific case number. Her tone was flat, dismissive, the voice of someone who had long ago given up on the stories contained within the mountains of folders. I don't have a case number yet. I'm looking for patterns, anomalies. Unexplained disappearances, particularly those without a body recovered, or where remains were found but not identified. I tried to keep my voice even, but a tremor of urgency ran beneath it. She sighed, a sound that seemed to rustle the very dust motes in the air. This isn't a library, Doctor. It's an archive of active and closed investigations. You can't just browse. I understand, I pressed, but my current investigation suggests a possible link to older unsolved cases. The details are unique. I'm looking for anything that matches specific criteria. Young adults, isolated disappearances, possibly rural or industrial sites involved. After a frustrating 20 minutes of bureaucratic back and forth, involving calls to a senior detective and a thinly veiled threat to escalate the matter, she finally relented, pointing me towards a bank of ancient microfiche readers. Section Delta 7. Missing persons 1985 to 1995. Good luck finding anything useful. Her words were a gauntlet thrown. I spent the next 2 days hunched over the flickering screen of a microfiche reader, the whirring of the machine a hypnotic counterpoint to the relentless clicking of the advancing film. Dust motes danced in the projector beam, illuminating faded reports, grainy photographs of smiling faces that had vanished without a trace. My eyes burned, tracing the minute print, sifting through the detritus of forgotten lives. I read about runaways, about suicides, about tragic accidents. But I was looking for something else. The absence of explanation. The cases that felt incomplete. On the afternoon of the second day, amidst a stack of particularly unremarkable files, a name flickered on the screen. Lena Petrova, missing 1989. The report was thin, almost dismissive. A young woman, last seen near the old industrial dockyards, a place now swallowed by urban redevelopment. What caught my eye wasn't the disappearance itself, but a single, almost parenthetical note tucked away in the evidence section. Witness reported unusual soil disturbance near abandoned warehouse, dismissed as construction debris. My breath hitched. Unusual soil disturbance, dismissed as construction debris. It was a throwaway line, likely ignored by the original investigators who were focused on more immediate, tangible clues. But to me, it was a siren call. The soil matrix clinging to the remains at the current site was distinctive, a unique blend of clay and fine-grained sand, mixed with microscopic industrial particulates, not typical for a natural burial. It was precisely the kind of soil one would find near an old industrial dockyard, disturbed and then compacted. I scrolled further, my fingers trembling slightly. The file included a blurry photograph of the area near her last known sighting. An abandoned warehouse, its corrugated iron rusting, stood sentinel over a patch of churned earth. And there, almost imperceptible in the low-resolution image, was a faint, shallow indentation. A depression in the earth that, to the untrained eye, could easily be dismissed. But I saw it. I saw the ghost of a meticulous excavation, a careful, deliberate act of concealment. I had found my echo. Lena Petrova, a name forgotten by time, was now inextricably linked to the silent witnesses I had unearthed. The limitations of past investigative techniques, the rush to judgment, the dismissal of seemingly irrelevant details, these were the killer's allies. And I had just found the crack in their armor, distinct from anything I'd cataloged from the other sites. I traced the line of the previous chapter's report with my index finger, the paper crinkling faintly under the low wattage bulb of the desert safehouse. The portable money counter humming softly in the corner, a strangely domestic drone amidst the sterile equipment and the grim cargo, seemed to mock the gravity of my work. This wasn't some forgotten burial ground. This was a signature. The new set of remains lay before me, carefully laid out on a clean sheet of butcher paper spread across a makeshift table fashioned from stacked crates. These bones, retrieved from a deeper excavation layer at the industrial site, were younger than the initial discovery, perhaps from the 1980s or early 90s, judging by the degree of cortical bone erosion and the presence of some synthetic dental composite. The previous victim, the one whose fragmented tibia had first caught my eye, had been interred decades before, closer to the mid-century. The gap was substantial, unnerving. I leaned closer, my magnifiers already in place. The world narrowing to the stark white of bone and the clinging ochre of the soil. The soil matrix. That was where the answer lay, or at least a significant part of it. The original report had dismissed the disturbance as construction debris, an understandable assumption given the site's history. But I knew better now. I'd seen the subtle but deliberate layering in the older burial, the specific type of aggregate mixed into the backfill, a signature unique to that initial perpetrator. My gloved fingers brushed against a clump of earth still adhering to the left femur. I carefully scraped a small sample into a petri dish. Under the stereo microscope, the story began to unfold. Yes, there it was. Not identical, but remarkably similar. The same unusual ratio of crushed limestone to coarse sand, the same distinctive, almost crystalline sheen on certain mineral grains. It wasn't the natural soil composition of the area. Someone had brought this in. Someone had prepared it. I moved on to the skeletal elements themselves. The skull, though fractured, allowed for a tentative reconstruction of the facial features. The victim was a young adult, likely female, based on the gracile mastoid processes and the relatively sharp supraorbital margins. The first victim had also been a young adult, though the sex was less clear due to the extreme fragmentation. My eyes meticulously scanned the ribs. Ribs were often overlooked, but they could hold a wealth of information about perimortem trauma. And there it was, a distinct fracture pattern on the 5th and 6th ribs on the left side, consistent with a focused, blunt force impact. My mind flashed back to the older remains. The first victim had presented with a similar, though more healed, fracture on the contralateral side. A coincidence? My gut tightened. Coincidences in forensic anthropology were rare. Patterns, however, were everything. I picked up the mandible, turning it over in my hands. The dental work was modern, as expected for the estimated time frame. But I wasn't looking at the fillings. I was looking at the wear patterns, the subtle asymmetry of the occlusal surfaces. And then, the faint but undeniable trace of a small, precisely drilled hole on the lingual aspect of the first molar. It was almost imperceptible, easily missed without specific magnification and the knowledge of what to look for. I pulled out my field notes from the first case, flipping to the page detailing the dental examination. My breath hitched. The older victim had presented with an identical, almost perfectly mirrored, drilled hole on the lingual aspect of the second molar. Not precisely the same tooth, but the same meticulous, almost ritualistic modification. It was too specific to be random. This wasn't a standard dental procedure. It was a marker, a signature etched into bone. The portable money counter continued its monotonous hum, a stark counterpoint to the racing thoughts in my head. This wasn't just a serial killer. This was a persistent serial killer. Someone who had been active for decades, perfecting their craft, leaving behind a chillingly consistent, if subtle, set of markers. The realization settled over me like a shroud. The first victim, unearthed from an abandoned factory, had been interred sometime in the late 1960s or early 70s. This current set of remains from the same industrial site was from the late 80s or early 90s. A 20-year gap at minimum between confirmed victims. My mind raced through the implications. Had the killer gone dormant for that period only to re-emerge? Or had there been other victims, other burials, yet to be discovered, filling that silent void? This wasn't a spree. This was a legacy. My determination hardened. I had found the pattern. Now I needed to find the man who made it. The low-wattage bulb of the desert safehouse cast long, wavering shadows across the stacks of reports and high-resolution photographs that covered every available surface. The portable money counter humming softly in the corner, a strangely domestic drone, did little to cut through the oppressive silence that had settled around me. I'd been here for what felt like days, sifting through the accumulated data from all 5 excavation sites. Each set of remains, each burial chamber meticulously documented, yet the killer remained a phantom. My index finger traced the line of the previous chapter's report, the paper crinkling faintly. My eyes were burning, but I pushed past the fatigue. There had to be something I'd missed, something subtle, buried beneath the obvious trauma and the ravages of time. The initial assessment, the one that pointed to a single perpetrator, had been based on the overall pattern of burial and the sheer audacity of the long timeline. But the how remained elusive. The methods seemed to shift, evolve, or perhaps I was simply seeing the killer's adaptation to different circumstances, different materials, different decades. I pulled up the 3D reconstructions of the skeletal remains on my tablet, zooming in on specific joints. The first victim, discovered at the oldest site, showed evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull, followed by disarticulation. The second, a clean, almost surgical severance of the major joints. The third, a mix. It was this inconsistency that gnawed at me. A serial killer usually refined their method, or at least maintained a consistent style. This felt polymorphic. I scrubbed a hand over my stubbled chin, the grit of the desert dust still clinging to my skin despite my best efforts. The air conditioner hummed, struggling against the heat that still seeped in through the insulated walls. I scrolled through the detailed photographic evidence, victim by victim, site by site. I focused on the points of disarticulation, the way the bones had been separated. Most often the cuts were rough, indicative of a blade used with force. But then I'd encounter a clean, almost surgical separation at the cartilaginous joints, the ribs from the sternum, the pelvis from the sacrum, where the bone itself was untouched, merely parted from its connective tissue. These were the anomalies, the outliers that contradicted the general brutality. I isolated these instances, creating a separate visual database. 7 times, across 3 different sites, I found this specific, almost delicate separation. It wasn't a hack job. It was deliberate, precise. It suggested an intimate knowledge of human anatomy, not necessarily from a medical perspective, but from someone who understood how the body was put together, how it could be taken apart with minimal damage to the bone itself. A preparator, perhaps. An artisan of sorts, working with the body as a medium. Then there was the binding. At first, I dismissed the various ties and restraints as opportunistic. Ropes, wires, even strips of fabric. But then, on the 4th victim from the 2nd site, and subsequently on the 5th and 6th victims from the 3rd and 5th sites respectively, I found it. Not a rope, not wire, but a residue. A faint, almost microscopic trace embedded in the periosteum of the long bones, and occasionally in the soil matrix directly surrounding the remains. A synthetic polymer filament. Extremely thin, almost like fishing line, but with a tensile strength far exceeding any common monofilament. It wasn't organic, and it wasn't a standard industrial tie-down. It was a very specific high-tech material, designed for precision binding or reinforcement. I leaned closer to the screen, magnifying the image of a femur. There, barely visible, were the faint, almost imperceptible grooves where this filament had once been cinched tight, holding the leg bone in a specific rigid position before burial. The filament itself had degraded over the decades, but its signature remained. It was used to articulate the disarticulated, to pose the cadaver. This wasn't just about burial, it was about presentation. My breath hitched. The precise disarticulation at cartilaginous joints, leaving the bone pristine, coupled with the unique polymer filament used for posing. This wasn't the work of a frenzied killer or a casual butcher. This was the work of someone with a specialized skill set, someone who understood anatomical structure intimately, who possessed the precision tools for clean separation, and who had access to or knowledge of advanced synthetic binding materials. Someone who, perhaps, sculpted or assembled. Someone meticulous, obsessive, with an almost artistic approach to their gruesome work. The killer wasn't just burying bodies. They were constructing them, posing them, leaving behind a macabre tableau. The inconsistencies I'd noted earlier weren't inconsistencies at all. They were variations on a theme. A killer refining their craft, experimenting, but always returning to this core signature. The blunt force trauma was the prelude, the means to an end. The disarticulation and posing were the art. The field of potential suspects, which had felt impossibly broad, suddenly narrowed to a sliver. Not just anyone could possess this combination of anatomical understanding, precision tool handling, and familiarity with specialized polymer filaments. This pointed to an individual who worked with their hands, perhaps in a field that required delicate assembly or structural reinforcement. Someone who saw the human form not just as flesh and bone, but as a manipulable structure. An artisan of death. The portable money counter continued its soft hum, an oblivious counterpoint to the profound and deeply unsettling realization that had just settled over me. The tension in the small safehouse thickened, pressing in on me, a tangible weight. I had found his signature, and it spoke volumes about the methodical, calculating mind behind the decades of disappearance. The portable money counter humming softly in the corner, a strangely domestic drone, did little to cut through the oppressive silence that had settled in after the last satellite call. I'd been at this for hours, the scent of stale coffee and printer toner clinging to my clothes. My eyes, gritty and tired, scanned the magnified images of cranial fragments, each pixel a silent scream from the past. The initial findings had been a blunt instrument, shattering the illusion of a simple, forgotten burial ground. Multiple individuals, buried over decades, meticulously concealed. But constants were not identifications. I needed a name, a face, a life to give back. I pushed aside a stack of aerial shots, the desert floor a flat, unforgiving canvas, and pulled forward a new batch of dental records. These belonged to the fourth set of remains, the one we'd tentatively dated to the late 1980s, based on the specific degradation of the polyester clothing fibers found near the bones. The cranium was largely intact, offering the most complete dental arcade of all the victims. My finger traced the digital contours of a maxilla, then a mandible. Each tooth, a tiny testament to a life lived, a story untold. I'd already noted the routine restorations, amalgam fillings, a few composite repairs. Nothing stood out, nothing screamed for attention. That was the problem. The killer had been meticulous in their disposal, but also, it seemed, in choosing victims who left minimal traces. But I was a forensic anthropologist. My job was to find the unseen, the overlooked. I leaned closer to the screen, adjusting the zoom, focusing on the occlusal surface of a left mandibular molar. The filling was a standard amalgam, unremarkable. But just at its distal margin, where the silver gray met the ivory, there was a faint, almost imperceptible line. A slight discoloration, a hairline fracture in the enamel, perhaps. Or something else. I scrubbed my temples, the fatigue a heavy cloak. No, it wasn't a fracture. It was too regular, too deliberate. I enhanced the contrast, pushing the image beyond what was probably advisable, until the pixelation threatened to obliterate the detail. Still, the line persisted. I zoomed in further, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't organic. It was metallic, a faint, almost microscopic inclusion. Not a part of the filling, not a stain. It was within the tooth structure itself, barely visible to the naked eye, even with a strong loop. "What are you?" I murmured, the sound of my own voice startling in the quiet. I cross-referenced the image with the initial X-rays taken at the excavation site. The inclusion wasn't clearly visible there either. Too small, too subtle. It would have been dismissed as an artifact of the film, a speck of dust, or simply overlooked in the rush to process the sheer volume of remains. But here, with the benefit of high-resolution digital imaging and unlimited time, it stood out. A tiny, defiant anomaly. My mind raced, cycling through every dental material, every oddity I'd ever encountered or read about. This wasn't a standard foreign body. It was too integrated. It looked like a specific type of inlay, a decorative or perhaps even a therapeutic inclusion, but one I hadn't seen in decades. It had a faint, almost coppery sheen to it, even through the digital filter. I pulled up an ancient digitized database of dental materials and techniques, a collection of obscure journals and forgotten practices from the mid-20th century. I scrolled through images of gold leaf inlays, platinum wire reinforcements, even some experimental alloys from the post-war era. Nothing quite matched. Then, buried in an article from a 1960s dental periodical, I found it. A description of a short-lived experimental dental alloy, a copper-silver tin blend, sometimes used for sub-enamel reinforcement in areas prone to stress fractures. It was notoriously difficult to work with, prone to discoloration, and quickly superseded by more stable materials. But for a brief period, a few pioneering dentists had experimented with it. The hairs on my arms prickled. This was it. This was the missing piece. I devoured the article, then chased its references. The alloy had been developed and primarily used by a small independent dental laboratory in upstate New York, which had then supplied a handful of practices in the greater New England area. The technique had been popularized by a single highly specialized dentist in Boston, a Dr. Alistair Finch, who had championed its supposed benefits before its eventual abandonment. The implications hit me with the force of a physical blow. Boston, upstate New York. Hundreds, if not thousands, of miles from this desolate desert grave. This wasn't a local victim who just wandered off. This was someone who had traveled or been transported a vast distance. The victim from the late 1980s, the fourth set of remains, had received this incredibly specific, outdated dental work in a particular region, likely from a very small pool of practitioners decades ago. Dr. Finch's practice had closed down in the early 1990s, but his patient records might still exist, or at least a list of his associates. The desert stretched on, indifferent and silent. It wasn't just the weight of the unknown. It was the hum of a faint, distant signal, finally cutting through the static. The game had just changed. The low-wattage bulb of the desert safehouse with portable money counter humming cast long, wavering shadows across the stacks of reports and high-resolution photographs that covered every available surface. The soft drone of the counter, a strangely domestic sound, did little to cut through the oppressive silence that followed my latest chilling revelation. I traced the outline of a faded topographical map, my finger lingering over the coordinates of the industrial site. The sheer audacity of it, the decades of meticulous work, stretched out before me like a vast macabre tapestry. My gaze returned to the compiled victimology. The sheer variety of the individuals, spanning generations, initially seemed to defy a clear pattern. Yet, as I overlaid the timelines, factoring in the anachronistic artifacts found with each set of remains, a different picture began to emerge. It wasn't about who the victims were individually, but what they represented. Each had been, in their own time, an outsider, a transient, someone whose disappearance would likely go unnoticed for years, if ever reported at all. This wasn't about a specific demographic, but a specific vulnerability. The killer, I realized, wasn't seeking a type. They were seeking expendability. This killer possessed an almost geological patience, a profound understanding of time and decay. The consistent ritualistic burial practices, the careful positioning of the bodies, the choice of a site that remained largely undisturbed for so long. It all pointed to an individual driven by an obsessive need for control, a desire to curate their own morbid collection. This wasn't a spree killer. This was an architect of death, a meticulous craftsman whose canvas was the earth itself. "He's a curator," I murmured aloud, the words tasting dry in my mouth. "A collector. He doesn't just kill, he acquires." This insight solidified the profile I had been building. The individual would be a loner, certainly, but also someone with an intimate knowledge of the industrial site, perhaps even a proprietary feeling towards it. Someone who could move freely, unobserved, for decades. The forgotten technologies weren't just misdirection. They were personal touches, relics of a past the killer felt comfortable in, perhaps even longed for. They spoke of a deep-seated nostalgia, or perhaps a deliberate rejection of modern surveillance. The detective arrived shortly after dawn, his face grim, a fresh thermos of coffee in his hand. He surveyed the wall of evidence with a new gravity. "You've been busy, Dean." "We've all been busy," I corrected, gesturing to the updated profile. "The pattern isn't in their faces, it's in their footprints, or lack thereof." He targeted the untraceable, the forgotten. Not just a dumping ground. It's his gallery, his sanctum. He chose it because he knew it would remain undisturbed for significant periods, offering him continued access and control. So, someone with a long-term connection to the area, the detective mused, pouring himself a cup. Or the site itself, someone who wouldn't draw attention. Exactly, I confirmed. Think about who would have the opportunity, the means, and the specific knowledge to maintain such a long-running operation. Someone who worked there, perhaps, or lived nearby for decades without ever truly leaving. Someone with a skill set that allows for discrete movement, perhaps even an understanding of excavation or construction that would allow them to blend in. We spent the next few hours refining the suspect list. The initial sweep had included hundreds of individuals with even a remote connection to the area. Now, with the refined profile of a patient, territorial, nostalgic collector who prized expendability and operated largely within the confines of the site, the list began to shrink dramatically. We focused on individuals who had lived within a 15-mile radius of the site for at least 40 years, those with occupations that afforded them specific access or knowledge, and those with a history of social isolation or a documented fascination with abandoned places or historical artifacts. One name kept surfacing, a man named Elias Thorne. He had been a maintenance worker at the industrial complex in its final years of operation, a quiet, solitary figure who then became a self-appointed caretaker of the surrounding desert land after the complex was officially abandoned. He'd lived in a small, dilapidated cabin just a few miles from the site for over 50 years, maintaining a low profile, often disappearing for weeks at a time. He fit the profile almost unnervingly well. Thorne, the detective said, circling the name on a whiteboard. He's old now, mid-70s if he's still alive. But he'd have had access, knowledge, and the isolation. And the patience, I added, a knot forming in my stomach. The meticulousness. This isn't a young man's game. This is the work of someone who has refined their methods over a lifetime. That afternoon, the detective and I drove out to Thorne's last known address, the dilapidated cabin. The air was thick with dust, the sun relentless. The cabin itself was barely visible, nestled amongst a cluster of ancient saguaros, almost swallowed by the desert. The cabin door hung ajar, a broken hinge creaking softly in the faint breeze. The windows were either shattered or boarded up. "Looks abandoned," the detective stated, drawing his sidearm. "Or recently vacated," I countered, my eyes scanning the ground. The dust around the entrance was disturbed, not by wind, but by foot traffic. Fresh tracks, too recent to be old. We pushed the door open further. The interior was a shambles, as if someone had ransacked it, but not for valuables. Papers, old tools, and a few tattered pieces of clothing were strewn across the floor. My gaze fell on a small, hand-carved wooden bird lying amidst the debris. It looked like something from a much earlier era, a relic. Then I saw it. On a dusty, makeshift workbench beneath a layer of fine sand was a faint imprint, a circular mark the size of a small, precise disc, and next to it, a faint, metallic sheen. I knelt, brushing away the dust. It was the residue of polishing compound, the kind used to restore antique metals, the exact kind of material that could have been used to meticulously clean and preserve the anachronistic artifacts found with our victims. He was here, too light to be the wind. A floorboard, perhaps. My breath hitched. The air crackled with a sudden, suffocating tension. We weren't just profiling a ghost anymore. We were hunting a phantom that had just passed through our very grasp. Suffocating silence. The scraping sound came again, a little louder this time, followed by a soft thud. It wasn't the wind. My eyes darted to the shadowed doorway. The detective, a man of quiet intensity, didn't move a muscle. His weapon held steady. But my forensic instinct screamed. This wasn't just an intruder. This could be him. The man who had eluded capture for decades, leaving only skeletal echoes. I needed to see, to understand. It wasn't a large figure, but its presence filled the small space. A glint of something metallic caught the faint light filtering through the grimy window. The detective didn't hesitate. He lunged, not firing, but tackling the figure with a grunt that vibrated through the floorboards. The cabin exploded into a flurry of motion. Wood splintered. A chair toppled with a crash. I instinctively ducked, my gaze fixed on the struggle. The figure was surprisingly agile, twisting, striking. A short, sharp yelp of pain, and I saw the detective recoil, clutching his arm. The detective, though injured, was already moving, his weapon now raised and aimed at the rapidly disappearing figure. A shot rang out, muffled by the cabin walls, then another. I followed, my heart hammering, ignoring the forensic tools scattered on the floor. My determination wasn't just about justice. It was about understanding the meticulous, horrifying artistry of this individual. The intruder was already a good distance away. a hunched silhouette disappearing into the scrubland that surrounded the cabin. The detective cursed, favoring his arm, but kept pace. The ground was uneven, a mix of dry earth and sharp rocks, making every step a challenge. My breath burned in my lungs, the cold air biting. The detective called out, his voice hoarse, but the figure didn't stop, didn't even falter. The chase led us away from the cabin, deeper into the desolate landscape. My mind was racing, trying to anticipate, to connect. Who was this person? And why here? Suddenly, ahead of us, a structure appeared. A low-slung building, almost camouflaged against the ochre landscape. It was stark, utilitarian, with a single unlit window. A faint, rhythmic hum became audible as we drew closer, a sound that seemed utterly out of place in this desolate expanse. "A desert safe house," the detective muttered, grim-faced, his eyes scanning for movement. He must have known we were coming. We moved cautiously, weapons drawn towards the entrance. The hum grew louder, a distinct mechanical whirring. The door, surprisingly, was unlocked. The detective pushed it open slowly, revealing a dimly lit interior. Inside, the hum resonated from a portable money counter sitting on a sturdy metal table, its digital display a glowing green. Stacks of crisp new bills were neatly arranged beside it, an incongruous sight in this Spartan hideout. The air was stale, smelling of dust, cheap coffee, and something else. A faint metallic tang. My gaze swept the room. It was sparse. A cot, a small camp stove, a few shelves. But on one shelf, tucked behind some canned goods, I saw it. A small, unassuming leather-bound journal. My forensic intuition flared. The detective gave a curt nod, covering me as I moved toward the shelf. My fingers trembled slightly as I pulled out the journal. It was old, its leather worn smooth by countless touches. I opened it to a random page. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant, a stark contrast to the horrific content. It wasn't a diary in the traditional sense. It was a ledger. The industrial site, the fragmented remains, the decades-long span. This was it, the meticulous record of a serial killer. But then a different kind of entry caught my eye. Not a date, but a name, scrawled in a different hand, followed by a series of numbers. A name I recognized from the initial police reports. A name that had been dismissed as an innocent associate of one of the earlier victims. A seemingly ordinary individual, a quiet craftsman, known for his intricate metalwork. The numbers, they looked like coordinates. My breath hitched. The metallic tang in the air suddenly made sense. It wasn't just a smell. It was the faint, lingering scent of specific metal polishing compounds, the same ones I'd noted on microscopic fragments found clinging to the older remains. The killer hadn't just buried his victims. He'd processed them with a craftsman's precision, using tools and techniques specific to his trade. A trade that also explained the bizarre, almost artistic arrangement of the bones. The portable money counter hummed its ceaseless, indifferent tune. He wasn't just killing. He was profiting somehow. The coordinates, the name. It was all here. The killer wasn't just a ghost. He was a meticulous archivist, a businessman of death. And now, he had a name. Arthur Finch. "He's been doing this since the late 70s, I murmured, my voice thick with the enormity of the discovery. This isn't just a killer, it's a legacy. Arthur Finch. The quiet craftsman, the numbers in the journal. They had to be a next location, a new target, or perhaps another cache of evidence. We had the name, the motive, the methods, but he was still out there. I had to confirm those coordinates now before Arthur Finch disappeared again, leaving only another silent skeletal witness. The race was far from over. The desert wind, a relentless sculptor of sand and rock, bit at my exposed skin as we approached the isolated structure. The lead detective had driven us hard, the vehicle's suspension groaning over the unpaved track that snaked toward the target. Arthur Finch. The name echoed in my mind, a chilling counterpoint to the thrum of the engine. The journal's cryptic numbers, once a source of frustration, had finally yielded their secret. A set of coordinates, precise to the meter, leading us here, to this desolate corner of the world. "Hold here." The lead detective's voice was a low growl from the front seat. He pointed towards a squat, windowless building, almost swallowed by the undulating dunes. "This is it. The desert safehouse with portable money counter humming." The phrase, delivered with a grim certainty, sent a shiver down my spine. The counter's insistent, rhythmic whir was already audible, a mechanical heartbeat pulsing through the stillness, even from this distance. I watched as the tactical team, a blur of dark uniforms and focused movement, fanned out, encircling the building. The air crackled with anticipation, a suffocating weight that pressed down on my chest. My role was clear: support, identification, evidence. But as the lead detective signaled the breach, a primal urge to confront the architect of so much silent suffering surged through me. The door blew inward with a concussive bang, followed by a chorus of shouts. We poured into the dim interior, dust motes dancing in the shafts of light that pierced through small, reinforced vents. The portable money counter sat on a rough wooden table in the center of the room, its digital display glowing green, a neat stack of bills beside it. Its incessant hum was now deafening, almost mocking. Arthur Finch was there, startled, his eyes wide with a sudden dawning comprehension. He stood by a workbench, his hands hovering over a collection of tools, his gaze fixed on the advancing officers. "Hands where I can see them!" the lead detective commanded, his weapon steady. Finch slowly raised his hands, his eyes darting around the room, assessing, calculating. My gaze, however, was already beyond him, drawn to the workbench. It wasn't just tools. Amidst the scattered wood shavings and metal filings, a small, meticulously carved wooden box sat open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were several delicate bone fragments. Not human, not yet. They were small, avian, but undeniably bone. And beside them, a fresh, meticulously carved wooden bird, a tiny, exquisite sparrow, its eye a bead of polished obsidian. My breath hitched. The birds, the recurring motif in the journal, the silent witnesses at each burial site. But these fragments, the fresh carving. "Don't move, Finch," an officer yelled, stepping closer. Finch's eyes flickered to me, a flash of something unreadable. Recognition? Defiance? Then his hand moved, lightning fast, sweeping across the workbench. He wasn't reaching for the trowel. He was aiming for the wooden box, intending to overturn it, to scatter its contents. "The box! Stop him!" I yelled, my voice raw, cutting through the tension. My forensic training took over, the instinct to preserve evidence overriding all else. The bones, the bird. The lead detective reacted instantly, lunging forward, disrupting Finch's desperate attempt. A brief struggle ensued, a flurry of practiced movements from the officers, and Finch was on the floor, restrained, the metallic click of handcuffs echoing in the room. I rushed to the workbench, my hands trembling slightly as I carefully examined the contents of the box. The bone fragments were indeed avian, precisely cut, almost surgically removed. The freshly carved sparrow was a mirror image of the ones found with the victims. But this one was pristine, unfinished. It was the event I had anticipated, the final, undeniable link. This wasn't just a hobby. It was part of his ritual, a macabre prelude to his horrific acts. My gaze swept across the rest of the workbench, and then to a series of shelves built into the far wall. They were filled, not with craft supplies, but with meticulously organized compartments. I pulled open one small drawer. Inside, nestled among desiccants, were small, desiccated plant samples. Another drawer held tiny, corroded metal fragments. Another, soil samples in labeled vials. Each one corresponded to a known burial site, cross-referenced by the dates in his journal. The reveal was staggering. Finch hadn't just buried his victims. He had meticulously documented the environment of each burial, preserving fragments as if cataloging his grim achievements. The plant samples, the soil, the metal. I murmured, my voice barely audible, pulling out a vial labeled Site 7, 1988, and comparing its contents to a mental image of the soil composition from the original excavation. It was an exact match, every detail. He curated his own crime scenes. The lead detective, kneeling beside the subdued killer, looked up at me, his expression grim. He didn't just hide them, Dean. He documented them. For himself, a sick private museum. The portable money counter continued its relentless hum, an incongruous soundtrack to the discovery of such profound evil. It spoke of another layer of Finch's life, perhaps how he funded his isolation, his tools, his endless supply of wood for his morbid creations. But for now, the primary mystery was shattered. He was real, tangible, and finally, caught. The portable money counter continued its relentless hum, a discordant drone against the silence of the desert safehouse with portable money counter humming. Its green digital display flickered, tallying a figure that grew larger than any of us had anticipated. But it wasn't the sheer volume of cash that held my attention. Not anymore. My gaze was fixed on the open ledger beside it, a thick, leather-bound volume, meticulously maintained. I ran a gloved finger over the faded ink on the first page. It wasn't a business record, not in any conventional sense. It was a chronology. Each entry, dated with chilling precision, detailed a victim. Finch hadn't just buried bodies. He had documented them, creating his own macabre archive, as if they were inventory. This was the final sickening reveal. Finch's motive wasn't a spontaneous rage, nor a pattern of convenience. It was a calculated, methodical pursuit, spanning generations. The money counter's hum now seemed to mock us, a soundtrack to the financial engine of a serial killer's life, funding his remote existence, his tools, his endless supply of wood for those custom-made coffins. He had perfected the art of disappearing, not just his victims, but himself, blending into the desolate landscape, an unseen phantom. I turned a page in the ledger. The entries shifted over time, reflecting subtle changes in his methodology, the evolving landscape of his hunting grounds. There were notations about procurement of specific tools, disposal of evidence. The tension in the small safe house was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket woven from the weight of decades of unresolved atrocities. Each page I turned brought another wave of unease, a fresh understanding of the depth of his depravity. This wasn't just a killer. He was a meticulous archivist of death. Back at the main site, the desert air, once a symbol of the victim's forgotten solitude, now felt like a cleansing wind. With Finch identified and apprehended, the full force of the investigative team descended upon the industrial complex. The bureaucratic resistance we'd faced early on had evaporated, replaced by a grim determination. Every square foot of the vast, desolate landscape was meticulously gridded, every disturbed patch of earth carefully excavated. My colleagues and I worked tirelessly, sifting through soil, cataloging every fragment of bone, every discarded button, every scrap of fabric. The initial assumption of a forgotten cemetery now seemed like a distant, naive memory. We found more remains, pushing the victim count higher than even my most pessimistic estimates. The limitations of outdated evidence, the challenges of working with remains decades old, had been immense. But we had pushed through. My forensic team, often working under the unforgiving desert sun, had meticulously pieced together skeletal puzzles, matching fragments, identifying unique trauma patterns. We'd leveraged every available technology, every obscure database, every anatomical marker to give these silent witnesses a voice. The identification process was arduous, yet profoundly rewarding. Dental records, mitochondrial DNA analysis, even subtle markers of past injuries or unique genetic traits, slowly but surely, gave names to the forgotten. One young woman, identified by a distinctive surgical pin in her femur, had been missing for over 40 years. Another, a teenager through a rare dental anomaly, had vanished in the late 70s. But the bones had spoken, and I had listened. The sheer scale of Finch's crimes, spanning generations, had demanded an equally monumental response. The long-term investigation, a marathon of detailed forensic work and relentless pursuit, had finally reached its conclusion. Weeks later, the last of the identified victims received proper burials. It wasn't just a ceremony, it was a reclamation. Families, some elderly, some who had lived their entire lives with the gnawing uncertainty of a missing loved one, finally had closure. I attended a few of these services, standing quietly in the back, observing the bittersweet relief on the faces of the bereaved. It was a stark reminder of why I did this work, why every aching muscle, every sleepless night, every frustrating dead end had been worth it. Justice, in its truest sense, had finally been served for those who had been silently buried and nearly forgotten for generations. The last vestiges of Finch's twisted legacy were being systematically dismantled. I knew the images of the unearthed graves, the silent bones, would stay with me, etched into my memory. But so too would the faces of the families, the quiet dignity of the reburials. My job was to speak for the dead. And in this case, for so many, their voices had finally been heard.